This conversation is not a critique of the story or production choices of the creators, because art is a reflection of people's lived experiences. People are limited by what they know. Art reflects some idyllic, and then art that reflects some idyllic world where everything is sunshine and roses isn't often compelling. And so we're not advocating for projects like that, but we're hoping that this conversation helps make connections between the themes that are present in these stories and the things that we see, and how we can co-create a world where people and communities have what they need to survive and thrive. If you want to get more plugged into these frameworks, the Amplify RJ community has lots of ways for you to do that. Those things are in the show notes. But let's get into it. I guess we should say, spoiler alert, we are talking about a TV show, The Last of Us on HBO. At the time of recording, we are through episode 3. Both Kalaya'an and I have played the video games, and so we know what's happening broadly in the story. But the first part of our conversation, we're just going to be talking about episode 3 and some things that have come up in episodes 1 and 2. At the end of the show, we'll let you know, but like everything will be on the table. So with that, let's get into it. Thank you to Wikipedia for this short summary that will get people caught up. For those that don't know, The Last of Us is a post-apocalyptic television drama series created by Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann for HBO. It's based on the 2013 video game developed by Naughty Dog. The series is set in 2023, 20 years after a mass fungal infection caused by a mutation in the genus Cordyceps sparked a global pandemic. The infection causes its host to transform into rabid, hostile creatures resembling zombies, and so this series follows Joel, played by Pedro Pascal, a smuggler tasked with escorting the teenage Ellie, played by Bella Ramsey, across a post-apocalyptic United States. So, we're in episode 3 of the series. We've gotten through some of Joel's backstory, some of Ellie's backstory, how Joel and Ellie met, and they've made their way out of Boston and now are making their way across the country in search of Joel's brother. But this episode, titled A Long, Long Time, is focusing on Bill and Frank. Bill is a survivor, a prepper who survived in his town, created this space for himself, and it follows his story with Frank, a man who he encountered a couple of years into the apocalypse. So back in 2003 in Lincoln, a town just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, Bill had been monitoring the evacuation of his town from an underground bunker beneath his house, then builds up his fortresses, ransacking abandoned businesses for supplies and materials to build a generator, electric fence, and traps. 4 years into that, while checking in on one of his traps, he finds a man named Frank who bargains for a hot meal, a shower, and fresh clothes. Before he leaves and moves on to Boston, where he intended to go, Frank talks Bill into playing the piano, and Frank deduces from Bill's passionate singing that he has never been with anyone in his life, kisses him, and the two men have sex. 3 years later, Frank convinces Bill to help him clean up the neighborhood so they can start making friends. The misanthropic Bill is skeptical, especially when Frank invites Tess, Joel's former partner, and Joel to lunch to establish a smuggling operation. Joel speaks with Bill and convinces him to accept Frank's plan by pointing out deficiencies in the town's defenses that he and Tess can help fix. Later, raiders attempt to infiltrate the town, severely injuring Bill before being repelled by his defenses. 10 years later, both Bill and Frank are elderly with degenerative diseases, leaving Frank wheelchair-bound, and he asks Bill to help him die. On his final day, Bill takes Frank to dress in new suits, and the two quietly perform a marriage ceremony in their living room. After dinner, Bill takes a lethal dose of sleeping tablets in Frank's wine at his request, and then Bill reveals that he also spiked his drink as well, admitting that he has no desire to live without Frank in his life, and they retire to their room to die in peace. For those of you that watched the episode, I'm sure that there were tears flowing, big feelings coming up. I just summarized that in brief, but what were your reactions as you were watching this?
As a middle-aged, single, queer prepper, this was a love letter to an entire generation of queer folks who survived through a pandemic that ravaged our community. Sorry, I'm getting emotional thinking about it. It is a hopeful glimpse into how we build community in the face of such horrible violence. It's also, I think, a critique on individualism within the United States, and especially within kind of the prepper community. But in short, this was about love, and I think that's what the entire both the game and I think the show The Last of Us is going to be about: love.
Yeah, absolutely. On the official Last of Us podcast, they've talked about like this whole season is about that love and like what love can drive you to do, or what the lack of love or what the overabundance of love can be. And, when we think about the characters of Bill, which I should say, played by Nick Offerman beautifully, and Frank, played by Murray Bartlett, both of, Parks and Rec and then like White Lotus and other things, fame respectively, what they brought to the screen was like this beautiful representation of a love story that we don't often see. And I know, like, not only having conversations with you, but a handful of people across, my life, that like, I think one of the things that resonated with people is like, that we found love in a hopeless place. Shout out Rihanna, right? Like in the midst of the world falling apart, everything crashing down, like for two people to find each other, to display vulnerability in that way, in ways that definitely Bill's character had never experienced before, was like a beautiful, touching thing. And the life they built together, with the ups and downs of, a 20-year relationship, arguing about furniture, arguing about paint, surprising each other with strawberries, and good food, like, and everything in between that goes on in a long-term relationship was a really beautiful thing for people to witness. And I know a lot of people were touched by it. At the same time, like you said, isolationist, horribly, horribly selfish at the end of the day. Part of what happens in the story when they're attacked by raiders, right? Bill has set up things that like ruthlessly kill scores of people, right? And those are the ones that we saw on screen, not counting the things that we imagined happened over the 20 years when we're thinking about a post-apocalyptic world. It is rather every man for himself. And, they do, because of Frank's willingness to make connections, like do end up crossing paths with Joel and Tess, to Bill's great resistance. And even that relationship is really limited, but it's made out of necessity. And I'm curious, like in your prepper, but also like community being such a community driven person, how was that sitting with you? What were the ideas that like you were trying to like simultaneously reconcile?
Yeah. So at the start, when we kind of like saw the prelude to the horror of the community getting mass murdered, right, by the state. And I remember Bill was watching through his CCTV and like not doing anything and being really angry. Like these are your neighbors. These are people that you can build with. I think that it is in a lot of prepper communities, there is this like lone wolf mentality. Like if I have enough guns, if I have enough, stored up food. But the reality is, if you look at any community or any group that has survived through genocide, through occupation, through colonization, it's only because they've built relationships with one another. They've built right relationships with one another, based on reciprocity, based on care. And I think that's, I was a bit afraid that it was going to, for those of you that have played the game or know how it rolls out, I was really glad that they brought Frank in to be that community builder. But yeah, I'm curious to know what your take was.
Yeah, well, just to like speak to that like part about Frank, right? I guess like we've gotten to this point of the game, and so like we should acknowledge that like this is different from the game, where when Joel and Ellie come across Bill in the game, Frank has left and left on bad terms, was bitten by infected and then killed himself so he wouldn't turn in. Like he was left with like resentment, and we didn't really explore the relationship between Bill and Frank, so we didn't know all those things. And so like this is a beautiful take on like expanding the universe, expanding on their relationship. But yeah, I think about a lot of things. Like you spoke to right relationship, and for those of you who are just listening to me talk on this podcast for the first time, restorative justice is a philosophy and set of practices rooted in indigenous values of interconnection, right? Where we are, yes, of course, restorative justice, repairing relationships when harm occurs, asking questions like what happened, who's impacted, and how do we make things as right as possible in order to heal, and prevent the harm from happening again, but it's also that building and sustaining, strengthening of relationships so we can be preventing future harm. And it's so helpful if those relationships are rooted in, when I define the term, like I talk about it as like equity and trust, but like you sharing like reciprocity, that's so important, right? You know, when I think about Bill the character and where he was in 2003, right? One of the things that, you know, stood out to me on like a second watch or like the watching of like the YouTube breakdowns of the shows, like, you know, the "Don't Tread on Me" flag that was in his house, right? And so like you already know like who this person is politically, and I think like partially this is a deep belief that I have, and a helpful belief that folks who often are practicing in a restorative way have, like, you know, at their core, humans are good, wise, and powerful, and want to be in good relationship. And, you know, Bill is a white man in 2003 America with a very strong libertarian streak, I imagine, right? And even though he and I might not be the best of friends, if I had encountered him in the world, right? Well, in 2003, I was a 12-year-old, but like if I had encountered him in these times, like there's probably not a lot that we could connect on. But like in the apocalypse, knowing somebody with those skills and trying to find ways to connect with people like that, to break down those barriers, break down those walls so we can survive together would be so important, right? I think, I was going to say Murray, the actor's name, but Frank's character is probably not someone who's very philosophically aligned or politically aligned with the character of Bill going into that space when he falls into his trap. He may have just been looking for like, hey, my group that left from Baltimore is all gone. I need help here, and I'm just trying to survive right now. And so like that's how he might have originally been thinking about their relationship and interaction, like being like rather exploitative for lack of a better word, but, you know, very quickly understanding, like seeing Bill for who he is, seeing their commonality, seeing their interconnection, and seeing how they could help each other, right? There's the scene where Bill is serving dinner and Murray like understands that like, oh, this place hasn't really been cleaned. There's a layer of dust. And like, I can play a role here. I can fit in here. I can help soften this place. I can bring beauty into this place. Like that's something that we should be thinking about when we are trying to ally or like be in coalition with folks to achieve like mutual goals. It doesn't necessarily have to end up in a 20-year romantic relationship, but like there are ways that we can be in community with folks, meeting each other's needs when we might not be like 100% aligned on like all the things we agree about in the world.
Yeah, I mean, co-sign to that. And I think it's interesting if you kind of like note the difference, if you compare the two dinner scenes, right, at the beginning and at the end. It was, you know, Bill's house was very drab, and after being with Murray for 20 years, there was color, there was artwork, there was like plants, and I think the balance between Bill's very pessimistic practicality, balanced with Frank's kind of like visionary artistry and care and just like love was like a really beautiful foil. And I think it just calls us, at least for me, that everyone has a place in, whether it's movement work, whether it is, community building. Not everyone has to be, this like a hardcore activist. We need artists. As human beings, we need art. That was one of the things that I stepped away with in this episode. We need beauty, and we need reminders of our humanity through pain and through suffering. And if we don't have that, then what is the world that we're actually trying to build? Because I would not want to live in the world that Bill was only living in, right? Where it's just like, I'm solo, I'm just gonna, go through that. How much less beautiful would his life have been if not for Frank, if not for reaching out to Tess and Joel, if not for having these moments. And I think, to me, that was just, once again, a reminder that community is really the only thing that keeps us safe.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about how even within the context, right, like you and I are having this conversation on Friday, February 3, 2023. next Thursday, we're going to air the episode that we recorded earlier this week talking about, what is the one thing that people can do in response to like continued anti-Asian violence or violence in intercommunal violence in Asian communities, right? And like, while there are problems of like white supremacy, capitalism, domination, like oppression of all types are still present, like we don't have to take on all of those things at once. Like, what is the one thing that you can do? Like, there are no capital A activists, unless like you're thinking about like maybe the Fireflies, like leaders of the Fireflies, like in the broad scheme of like this universe that they're living in. But everybody has a role to play, right? People need food. People need gasoline and power. People need water, right? People need like those things that like Bill is really, really good at finding a way to make that happen. People need protection. What that protection looks like, maybe is a whole different conversation for another time. Doesn't necessarily look like guns or somebody with a badge and a gun to carry out state-sanctioned violence. Conversation for another day, another time. But we also need people who are, like, as you were saying, providing beauty, providing care, right? And like care looks like a lot of different things. And so as you're thinking about, we do not quite live in a post-apocalyptic, disaster-ridden world, but there are things that are happening in our communities on the daily that leave people in situations, or like maybe leave you yourself in situations where you do need care in some way, shape, or form. You might not be the person who can solve all the problems for everybody, but you can be a person who does one thing. And I think one of the things that, one of the problems with Bill's attitude towards the world is like, you have to be willing to ask people for help, right? In the lunch scene where Joel and Bill, people who are both lone wolves and of themselves, like, are very much about, I'm going to protect myself, I'm going to protect those who I care about. Frank in Bill's case, Tess in Joel's case, in that time, right? They're not really interested in building relationships, but Joel's character points out the flaws in the setup, right? This wire is going to rust and going to break down. I can get you something better. Right? You need us. We can get you medicine, right? And Bill would never have asked for that, right? And would have had to figure out some other way to address those problems, or not, and then get like taken down by raiders or infected or some way, shape, or form. So it's like, both be the person who is willing to do the one thing, whatever your gifts are, but like also don't be afraid to ask. And like, that's really hard. I know, like, you and I had a conversation about that earlier, right? Like, you offered care to me last week in the form of like food, meals, like taking a burden away from me, like not having to worry about how to feed me and my family. But like you were saying at the same time, like, I don't know what I need. I don't know what support looks like. I don't know what to ask for. I think that's something that a lot of people are struggling with as we're navigating these times, pandemic, all the things that are coming along with living in 2023.
I think I'm hoping what folks kind of like move from this with is we can do things, we can really think locally about the change that we want to make, but without collective action, things aren't going to change. Like, if the Fireflies, I'm not going to spoil anything, but if the Fireflies are only operating out of Boston and the entirety of Turtle Island is still affected by the fascism of Fedra, things aren't going to change. Mm-hmm. But it's because of these smaller groups, once they start building their collectives, once they start building this network and this ecosystem of care and support. Sorry, I'm not calling it the fire. Well, I mean, what I'm talking about. Yeah. If different communities start building that care and support, that's one step towards ensuring the safety of all communities. Because like, if one community is under attack, all communities are vulnerable. I think that going back to Bill being kind of like a lone wolf, there's no such thing as a lone wolf in nature that survives, right? Mm-hmm. Wolves run in packs. And I think that the more we can see a sense of mutual responsibility for caring for one another, it makes it more likely for us to survive through whatever living nightmare we're subjected to in this world. To what you were sharing earlier around like, how do we support one another? And I think it's one, understanding what our own capacities are to be able to provide support and offering those. The thing that I've learned from Indigenous organizers in Standing Rock back in 2016, in Maori organizers in 2019, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, was that in the face of colonial state violence, they were still able to create an entire ecosystem of care. There was healthcare, there was food. And it's because there was like a sense of mutual responsibility. Like when folks show up and they need support, they also provide support. Like I remember in Standing Rock, we were there, and one of the aunties was like, "Go start chopping wood." Mm-hmm. And I think that's a clear way. Like if folks are thinking like, okay, what do I do and how do I start? Assessing your capacity first, knowing what the needs of your community are, and really starting building locally help us to really reimagine and work towards a safer world.
You and I are putting this together as we go, and I'm thinking about, the possibilities of our conversations, right? I don't think the Fireflies are a perfect organization that we should aspire to recreate in times of the apocalypse. And, for those of you who know the video game lore, you'll know why. And, no spoilers, but I'm curious, and I think this might be a conversation that we carry on through our time talking about the show. What does a community of care look like in this Last of Us world, right? Where we have oppressive forces of Fedra, where we have, autonomous, this is a community of two. There are other non-Fedra communities out there in the world. What does a community of care really look like?
I think it looks like centering and following the leadership of those who are most affected by violence, mm-hmm. right? Or those who are most marginalized by either the state or whatever system of oppression folks are experiencing. A community of care is one where all of us are seen as contributing and valuable members of the community, not just because of what we can provide, but for the mere fact that we're human beings. Community care is based in solidarity, not charity. It's one that is power with, not power over. It recognizes that I cannot survive without you surviving. And I think that was one of the key things within episode 3, when Bill was saying, I found my purpose. I wasn't scared before I met you. And it was, yeah. Sorry, I'm all going all over.
Well, and I think this is a much longer conversation, but I think about in, post-apocalyptic times, and post-apocalyptic storytelling, right? The enemy is not really the virus or the zombies or the infected. It ends up being each other, right? In our attempts to survive and protect our own communities. You often think about the phrase the strongest survive, and we actually know it's those that are able to adapt are the ones that survive. But in this dog eat dog survival of the fittest, as it's often framed, world, right? This world focuses on primarily white, or at least white passing characters, right? Whose identities aren't on the markets. At the beginning of this episode, we see a Black woman and her newborn child having been gunned down because there was no room in the quarantine zone, right? And so these ideas of white supremacy, ableism, within even within this story, right? Homophobia, those dynamics still exist in post-apocalyptic times. And when you talk about centering the needs of the people who are most impacted, who's most impacted when there's a zombie apocalypse, right? Kind of everybody, right? And then what are the ways that we make the choices about, how to allocate resources, who to protect, how to protect them, how to care, right? As beautiful and lovely as we get to see two gay men grow old and die together, right? What did their lives do? Other than at the end of this episode, provide a car battery to Joel and Ellie, who are, in some way, shape, or form on the search for a cure for this virus. What did their lives really do to contribute to the collective struggle of people who are facing violence and trying to navigate this time of apocalypse? Not a whole ton, right? And Bill had lots of skills to offer. Frank had lots of skills to offer. Yeah. Where they would offer those things might not have been the Fedra quarantine zone, but there are lots of other places that they could have been impactful. And again, this is not about judging storytelling choices, right? Because these are reflective of things that happen in the world and things that characters do. And we wouldn't be having this conversation without that. But, is there anything that you reimagine for Bill and Frank's story that could have been more community care centric?
Yeah, in my writing of it, Bill would have actually been, very good friends with his neighbors, and would have, even though they would have been like, this is the quirky, weirdo prepper guy, they would have all had, bunkers in their homes. They would, because like, I think they all have like similar layouts, right? I think that 2003 was during the Bush years. And I think, if we're taking it from like, there's parallel timelines, the US at the time was extremely Islamophobic, was very turning extremely insular. I think that a lot of community, I remember my community, like a lot of folks started becoming preppers, and this was also after the Y2K scare and everything. So I think recognizing that the political reality that was happening in this country, perpetuated by the state, a better kind of storyline for me. And once again, not throwing shade. Absolutely love everything that's being done right now, but for me in my head would be Bill actually, we see like that opening shot of Bill looking at the Fedra trucks, but they're all empty because everyone's in their homes.
Yeah.
And after Fedra leaves, everyone comes out, and that's when they start building. So for me, that's where I would kind of diverge. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, like as much like you work for an organization called Nonviolent Peace Force. So, and I work for an organization. I run an organization called Amplify Restorative Justice, which like generally tend to be like nonviolent approaches. But like there are times for violence, right? And like, what would it have looked like for that community to like say, Fedra, get the F out of here. We're going to take care of ourselves. Like, we don't need your support. We're going to like do this on our own. I think that's another way that like we could have gotten to this base of like, hey, like let's take care of each other. And I know like that sounds like the dichotomy of like being somebody who cares about like a social safety net and like having resources provided by the government to take care of people with like, oh no, autonomous communities, like those are like two things that you have to hold in your hand at once. But what could that have looked like? I don't think that we see that anywhere in the Last of Us universe. Yeah, go ahead.
We definitely don't. And it's kind of like with my nonviolent hat on. I think that, we saw Fedra, they had all the guns, they had all the tanks, they had all of the weapons in the world. And if we're looking at the Fireflies as as kind of like a counterpoint, like this is by no means a critique on armed resistance. Folks need to protect themselves how they need to protect themselves, but also protection can also look like getting out of the scope of the state. There are many communities that kind of like fly under the radar of state surveillance, intentional communities and whatnot. But I mean, the reality is the United States loves its guns, right? Mm-hmm. I think that folks would have been armed if Bill went kind of like the community route. But the use and the force of arms alone won't ensure the safety of any individual or any community,
right?
Without that social net, safety net, right? And how do we build that on a smaller scale? How do we take the lessons learned from mutual aid groups that have been, operating since the Black Panthers started the free breakfast and free lunch programs, right? This is, sorry, all my neurons are like going, and I'm hoping it's also, this is eliciting like questions for folks, like what do we do in the face of disaster, and how do we keep ourselves safe?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to wrap us up, letting folks know that hopefully this episode, this conversation is being released today, if not tomorrow. We're going to be back early next week, summarizing, the first half of the season. So episodes 1, 2, we've pretty extensively talked about 3 and 4, but then hopefully after that, going weekly, drawing out these themes, having these conversations about justice. Right now, I know for sure, if you're listening to this, if you have questions, you can get in contact with us at media@amplifyrj.com. I'll link that in the show notes or the description of wherever this is. You can get in touch with either of us on Instagram, Amplify RJ, or yours is?
At Kala, Kala, Mendoza, Mendoza.
Beautiful. And so we're going to sign off. For those of you who don't want any spoilers right now, this is your warning. Bye. And like now, there are some things that are paralleled in like both Bill and Joel's storylines, like that we know moving forward, that like I think would be really helpful to tease out. So if you've played or watched the video games all the way through, you know in the end that, you know, as much as like Bill and Joel are protectors, who like go to any length to protect like what's theirs, like that's super toxic, right? Like the way that Bill was like isolationist and protected, you know, ended up with him like, hey, I've lived my life with Frank, and like there's nothing worth living. You know, when Joel comes to the hospital when Ellie's on the surgeon's table and is about to be killed in the name of research for the cure, he's like, no, this is my purpose. Like I've got to protect, right? Bill leaves that suicide note with Tess's name, but I think in that moment Joel like substitutes like Ellie's name in there, like both like, hey, I failed Sarah, my daughter who's died. I failed Tess, my partner, who just died. Like Ellie's it for me now. And, you know, I don't know that person can shift out of that pattern of protection, even if it is for the benefit of everyone, right? Bill built his life to protect him and Frank. Joel has built his life to protect him and Ellie. Could that, like, is that just like endemic to who those people are, or is there another way?
I think it is. I mean, it's like the savior mentality, right? It's not based in solidarity. It's like, I have power over you, so I'm going to tell you what you're going to do. At the end of the first game, like Bill not giving Ellie, or not even informing Ellie, like, do you want to do this, right?
Joel.
Because like, or sorry, Joel. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you want to give your life, and like depriving them of what they felt their purpose was? Like, how dare he? And it doesn't. It's so selfish, and it doesn't take into into account Ellie's autonomy, and for the entire world, we could have had a cure. So we also saw that in the goodbye letter to Bill from Frank. So I think it's another kind of like calling into folks that want to be that protector or that savior. We don't need saviors, right? We need solidarity. We need people that actually listen. And to the show, love me like I want you to love me.
Right. And I think, you know, now spoilers for the video game, like The Last of Us 2, right? Like Bill, now you got me. Joel lies to Ellie about, you know, the decision that he made to like prevent her from dying, preventing her from like having the chance to be a contributor to like a cure for all of this. And she resents him for that, right? She goes and finds out the truth. And like that severely damages their relationship to like, again, spoiler, if you really do not want to know what happens at the end of this or like in future seasons, like Joel dies at the hands of the people who he killed in order to keep Ellie alive, keep Ellie safe. And, you know, that whole game is about like now Ellie's revenge tour against those people, right? And you know, the cycle of violence continues and continues because of like saviors and because of protectionism. I think about, you know, everyone was so excited about the original Black Panther movie, right? But like the policy of Wakanda was like Wakanda first, right? America first, like at the expense of like everybody else who's being harmed. And right, as beautiful as a space or a life you can create for yourself and however you define your people can be, it's causing harm to a lot of others. And, you know, each of us have to reconcile what those boundaries are for ourselves. Like, I think I was having a conversation with Christine Jung, who is going to be on This Restorative Justice Life next Thursday, about, you know, what I've experienced as a parent over the last couple of years. And like, I have a deeper understanding and like more grace for people who like, I will do anything to protect my family at all costs. Like I even told her, like, I will, like, for like kids on the playground who like threaten or like not even like maliciously threaten, but like maybe like mischievously or like curiously threaten like the safety of my 10-month-old kid, like I will F you up to like stay that way, right? Like, and that's not healthy. Right? How do we navigate those things is a conversation that I think, you know, we might be continuing to have like at the end of these episodes, knowing that, you know, protection is going to continue to be a theme that comes across all of this, and like, you know, what are the limits of when that's healthy and not?
Yeah, it's and kind of like with my organizational hat on, like what we do is called unarmed civilian protection, and we practice mutual protection in communities. So it's, once again, it's really about not having that savior mentality. It's about solidarity. And what does that look like in our lives for those who we most, love and want to protect? But at what expense does that protection come if we don't actually listen to those most directly affected by violence, by the issue? So
I really, really appreciate having conversations like this about like that connect the things that we're seeing in media, like in stories, to our real world, because yes, they are entertainment, they're distraction. It's fun to get swept up, and I know that's like where some people leave it, and like no judgment of that. But as somebody who like really deeply thinks about building a better, safer world where people can thrive, not just survive, where we can have the skills, practices to be in right relationship with each other, having these conversations is really great. And so I'm so thankful for you for being a part of this. Again, if you stuck around with us through the spoiler-filled part, we'll be back at some point early to mid next week in whatever feed or wherever you're viewing or watching this. So subscribe, follow, like, review, all the things. And like, if you're old school, tell a friend, if you've appreciated this kind of conversation. Anything to leave the people with?
No, just be safe, y'all, and we keep us safe.